So a few years ago, I got a private pilot's license, and while this might not apply to everybody as it's kind of a specific thing that only certain people are going to be interested in doing, I think that the experience of it is pretty broadly applicable to everybody. So I did it because I was interested in potentially going into flying professionally, and I was just personally interested in aviation from a young age, so it was just fulfilling to me to do this regardless of whether or not it turned into a professional career. This is a picture of my first solo, and apparently there's a tradition where you cut out the back of your shirt and draw a picture on it. I don't really understand it, your guess is as good as mine. While I personally really enjoyed the experience, I wouldn't recommend it to everybody for a few reasons. It's very expensive, it's very time consuming, there are definitely risks involved, and it is good to have some personal interest in it to stay motivated and continue the course. For me, aside from just enjoying the experience on its own, it's also been good for things like job applications. While nobody has appreciated me putting that down as a technical qualification for a desk job, that has been helpful to reference for some of the lessons that I took from the experience. And even if you don't specifically have interest in flying, I think that these lessons can come from a lot of different hobbies and experiences that people might have. The first one is discipline. So similar to exercise, I think it's good for everybody to have some sort of personal development routine. Doing anything over a long period of time trains discipline, and it's a lesson to yourself that your changes and actions over time have impacts long term. So pretty much everybody does get this experience through doing school coursework, but I think that there is a benefit to doing this outside of where you're required to do it for schoolwork. There's something that's empowering about choosing to do something and then sticking with that and seeing a goal achieved that you chose to do on your own. Making that independent decision to do something long term that changes your life has an impact on how you see the world and think about any sort of activity that you might want to do. The second one is mentors, and I did not anticipate how different my learning experience would be with different instructors. So I had one instructor that I started with and did most of my coursework through, and then I got another certification through a separate instructor. And their teaching methods and approaches to flying were dramatically different, which taught me a lot about sort of the spectrum of performance or behavior within any given field. So my first instructor was very diligent and by the book, almost religiously so. We always followed the rules, we always checked our checklists, and we did everything step by step, always exactly the same. Now this made everything that we did extremely thorough and safe, which was great, but it also made the entire process feel very burdensome and challenging every time we did it. My second instructor was very laid back and unconcerned about anything. On our first flight together, we went out and got into the airplane and were ready for takeoff. So while my first instructor would have been extremely thorough about pre-flight checks and planning the entire flight before we did anything, my second instructor simply said, "Let's go get in and go for a ride." Compared to my first instructor, this seemed a little bit alarming to me. Weren't we missing a lot of steps here? So I asked him, "Don't we want to do a quick check of the airplane?" And he looked at me and said, "My people do that," and just left it at that. He didn't say anything, but I could tell that he kind of thought that I was being stupid. I was being too uptight and worried about stuff. I was the uninitiated kid who didn't understand anything. And on top of that, to him, it seemed like I was suggesting that he didn't know what he was doing as the experienced instructor. So anyway, we get in and we take off, and sure enough, about 5 minutes into the flight, we notice that one of the gas tanks is just completely open. Now this is a totally rookie thing that would have immediately been noticed if we had done any checks at all on the plane, but we didn't, and there it was, an obvious problem that we had completely missed. Now, I didn't say anything, but I'm pretty sure he knew what I was thinking. Now, up until that moment where we had seen the mistake, I was actually thinking to myself that maybe I was being foolish. Maybe I was being a little too over-concerned, and maybe he was right to just be a little more hands-off and relaxed about this process. But once I realized the mistake, I realized why my first instructor had been so diligent, and I appreciated that approach much more, and it's definitely the approach that I prefer and take now. But this little experience in itself was eye-opening to me. It made me realize that there is a very large spectrum of different approaches to this one activity. If my first instructor was the only instructor I had ever known, I would think that every pilot was very diligent, and I would wonder how can accidents possibly happen when everybody is so careful about this stuff. If my second instructor was the only one I had ever known, then I would wonder how does anybody do anything properly and why aren't there accidents all the time? It definitely gave me a different perspective on how different people teach and learn things, and it made me realize that a lot of this really does come down to just personal preferences and how people think about things, and that there probably are better approaches than others, and it's good to be exposed to different people's perspectives so that you might understand which ones do and don't work well. There is something about the learning experience of something like flying that is different from school. It's a much more one-on-one experience, and with something like flying, there's a lot more trust involved where both of you have each other's lives in your hands, and you really need to focus and work together to make sure that you're both safe through the entire process. It's a pretty different dynamic from a normal classroom, and it definitely gave me different perspectives on learning and teaching. The third one here is just expanding your comfort zone. So going into flying, I was definitely worried about some things, namely the safety, the complexity of the aircraft, and just making sure that all the steps were followed. But what surprised me was that the thing that scared me the most was actually the tower communication as opposed to flying the airplane. And apparently this isn't unusual. A lot of people are very intimidated by the radio communication, and I was much more so than I had anticipated once we got into that. There's a lot of jargon involved that you need to learn, and people typically speak very fast and concise to keep communications as short as possible. And you need to really be on the ball to pick up everything. And it can be pretty hard to keep track of while you're flying that you're doing this complex activity to begin with, and then on top of that, you have to decipher this almost coded language that people are speaking over the radio, and you have to speak that same language back. You can actually hear what some of this chatter sounds like through some apps that are out there, but I think you can kind of get the idea that there's a lot of pilots out there. You don't want to sound stupid over the radio, and it's just a lot to keep track of that can seem a little bit overwhelming. So the first few times that you do this, it can seem really scary approaching the airport, and you have to have a script in your head of exactly what you're going to say and how you're going to respond with any response that they might give you. But as with anything else, over time this becomes a much more routine process, and it expands your comfort horizon to feel okay doing this thing. And the last one for me was simply the unexpected. The best thing that I got out of my flight training was actually from the worst experience I had doing it. So as part of the curriculum for getting your private pilot's license, you have to do a 150-mile, 3-point cross-country round-trip flight. I had long awaited getting this garbage out of the way. I was very concerned about it, and the day was finally here for me to do it. Now, I was aware that there had been an electrical issue on one of the main airplanes that I typically flew with. So naturally, I was a little bit concerned about this on the day of my solo 150-mile flight. And before I went out the door, the head mechanic of the shop assured me, "Don't worry, I just changed the alternator in there. You're gonna be all set." As soon as I heard this assurance, I was scared. This meant that the alternator was untested, and we didn't even know for sure that this fixed the problem if this was the first time the plane was going to be flying after this fix was put in. But at this point, it was sort of part of the exercise to just go out and do it. I had been assured by the mechanic that everything was fine, and I just had to fly the plane. So I start out on the flight and everything is going fine. First leg is done, I'm headed to the second airport, and I notice that things are getting a little bit quiet. Now, I didn't think much of this. It was sort of a rural area that I was in. There might not have been that many planes around, so I just continued with the flight. I land and I take off, and then I realize that nobody is saying anything. Nobody's responding to me. There are no other reports at all. I can't hear anything. And shortly after that, I realized that the radio was completely out and the other electronics were starting to fail. So considering that the radio communication was one of the biggest sticking points to me and one of the largest challenges to overcome, flying into the airport with no radio at all, you can imagine, was even more intimidating. But at this point, I was already in the air and there was no turning back. I had to go and land at the airport with no radio. Now, I was extremely fortunate in that I had actually experienced this with my instructor on a different flight. And I saw that he had taken out his cell phone and called the tower without the radio so he could just give them a heads up of what was happening. Now, when we went on that flight, it was very quiet and there was basically nobody else in the air. Whereas on my solo flight, it was in the middle of the day and more busy. So I knew that I might potentially encounter more issues, but I had no choice other than to just go to the airport and hope that things would be resolved. So I called them up on the phone, all the jargon went out the window, and I just said I need to land. My electronics are out, I don't have any communication, and I don't have my flaps. I'm gonna need to modify the landing procedure. Now, I hadn't even thought about turning down the engine a little bit so he could hear me, so we're both screaming over the phone. But I could hear that he was trying to help me out, and he said, just fly on in and don't worry about anything. So I did that. I modified the landing procedure. I flew in, I looked around and hoped that nobody was around. It's very hard to see in the pattern to know where everybody is without radios, but everything worked out okay and I landed the plane. Immediately after I landed, there was a fleet of fire trucks following me on the ramp. At this point, I didn't really know what was going on. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to stop right there, if I was supposed to pull over at the nearest spot, or if I was supposed to just continue back to my normal parking spot like nothing happened. So I chose the latter and just continued back to my regular parking spot as if nothing was happening. And this fleet of fire trucks followed me all the way there. Apparently what had happened was the tower had informed the flight school that I was having this issue, and they thought that there may have been an engine fire and called up the fire department. So here I was at the end of the flight feeling very embarrassed over what had happened. I thought I did the wrong thing. I was embarrassed that the fire trucks were called out when they didn't need to be, and it felt like I had messed up a lot. And actually what happened was the flight school apologized to me and said that I had handled everything well and that there was nothing to feel bad about. The lesson from all of this was that everything turned out fine. It was a very stressful experience for this to be a solo flight where I was by myself in the airplane and had to sort it out. But what I found was that everybody in the process really wanted to help out, and they were happy that everything was okay in the end. I didn't need to feel embarrassed about anything, and it was a good thing to overcome, and everyone else in the process was great and really helpful. And that was another lesson that other people in the world generally want to help you out and help you to succeed. And that's a really good thing to keep in mind with anything in life. Unexpected things like this come up in life, and sometimes we're forced to face them where we haven't seen them before. I was very fortunate in that I had a very good instructor who did prepare me for things like this. And I had seen a similar scenario before, and he was able to walk me through how to handle something like that. We don't always have that support in situations, but it is good to remember even in those circumstances that usually somebody is out there who can help you out and people want you to succeed. Also, it's just good to remember to always be a little bit skeptical when somebody assures you that everything is fine. Trust, but verify. So even if you're not interested in flying specifically, the point is that pretty much any hobby or experience is going to have unexpected growth opportunities. So it's great to just get out there and try stuff.